Tabo, a very good evening to you. Thank you for coming in. So we know the problem, right? The issue is that there simply doesn't appear to be enough beds for the number of students who need a place to stay. Does a solution exist that works for students, universities, and the department?
Thank you, Sembigile, for having me. I think we framed the issue wrong from the word go. I think we need to declassify this whole accommodation crisis issue. We have an affordability crisis where, for instance, universities like Wits University, which are universities located in the metro, which have exorbitant tuition fees, exorbitant living expenses around them. And then you have an accommodation crisis, for instance, in like University of Venda, where you have 10 people sharing a room, given the limited number of beds. Now, the issue at Wits is not that there are beds that are empty. It's that there are beds that are empty throughout the year. Sorry, it's not that there are beds that are fully occupied. It's that there are beds that are empty throughout the year simply because the likes of City Property, Huruko, etc., are charging students exorbitant tuition amounts, 6.5, 7,000 rand, and therefore students cannot afford those particular amounts. So when we begin to declassify what an accommodation crisis looks like institutionally, we'll begin to become more creative in terms of how do we begin to solve some of these pressing issues that are faced by students. For instance, even at University of Mpumalanga, I'll make an example. They are having fundamentally different accommodation challenges to that of Wits. And if you use an umbrella term, we won't be able to see the various nuances that are affecting students across the sector.
I'm glad you talk about an umbrella term, because in its defense yesterday, Wits said, actually what you're seeing are protests over groups of students who have not been able to get accommodation this year because they failed to meet NSFAS academic criteria, some having failed or performed poorly in certain modules, and that is why the university is unable to accommodate them. And they're asking the question, why should the university bear the brunt of of accommodating people, at least, who fall outside the criteria? How do you respond to that as the union?
Look, the reality is that those particular students are registered as we speak. Now, if a student, the very same video that was circulating on social media where students are sleeping in libraries, which is not unique to Wits, it's just that it has a proximity to media. You have instances at CPUT, Bellville campus, TUT, every other university where students are living in inhumane conditions. Now, how are you going to expect that very same student to perform well academically when we're approaching March, April, very soon May, and those various students still don't have a place over their heads, still don't have food to eat in that particular regard? So it would be disingenuous of a university to come and say those very same students, etc., cannot register or cannot get accommodation simply because they failed various modules in the past. For the mere fact that they are student currently in the system, therefore they should be given the necessary accommodation on time with the necessary facilities.
But I suppose another layer to it, especially in the more urban areas, Wits, let's use that example, you've got a lot of private accommodation providers, and the issue with that, just on what you were talking about, just the affordability issue,
sure,
is that institutions and government don't necessarily have control over what private service providers are charging.
Look, as a union, we've deliberated extensively on this to say that the next fight must be taken to these private service providers. You cannot have a private service provider located next to a public university charging for students, for instance, 6.5, 7,000, 7.5, depending on where you're staying. And so the government failure, the Department of Higher Education has failed. We've mentioned this in the past. Regulate those private accommodations around public universities. Cap the particular amount. You've capped the NSFAS fee. How come you cannot cap your private service providers around the university? And we're saying equally to them, they must not be exploiting students. Students are desperate. Universities have acknowledged that they cannot accommodate every single student in the system currently. And by virtue of that, we're saying that even the private sector must come on board to say that, look, we are aware of the challenges that universities are facing. We are providing a service, but that service must be within some reasonable means for students to be able to afford. You cannot have a situation where a bed is empty the whole year on the basis that I cannot afford.
I want to go back to the point that you were making about just the difference in the treatment to an extent between a Wits versus a Univen or Forte University. What work are you doing as a student union to make sure that there is a fair and equitable way in treating the problems of the institution, be it a poorer university or the more affluent ones?
Look, as a union, we treat all student issues with equal attention. We've been to your Univens. In fact, we were here just last year discussing the issue of Univen. We brought the issue to the media because the issue really does not lie with the union. The issue lies with the media, where it rushes to those institutions which have proximity, given their historical trajectory. So if a Wits will go on a protest today, or a UCT will go on a protest today, you'll tend to run to those particular institutions. I'll make a classic example. Let's look at UCT Sharkville in 2015. We speak about Sharkville as if it only happened at the University of Cape Town, whereas at CPUT, Cape Peninsula University of Technology, they equally had a Sharkville that particular year, but that never found expression in the media platform. So journalists equally have a role to play in terms of being deliberate in terms of highlighting some of the issues that students are facing, as well as bringing government to account. I mean, you must be able to go to UniZulu. I don't know if you've seen the conditions at University of Zululand.
We did actually have a reporter at UniZulu at the beginning of this week reporting on the protest there and how students there are battling as well. But the difference, if we can call it that, in the treatment then of rich versus poor at university level also, as you say, manifested itself during Fees Must Fall. Here in Johannesburg alone, you had University of Johannesburg students who said, we actually don't want to march side by side with Wits students because they benefit from a certain privilege. And I wonder how far you've come in healing the tensions between the different student communities in the different contexts.
Look, the issue about institutional privilege really does go to the issue of their historical trajectories. But what we're saying to government, I'll make a classic example. The issue stems beyond protest, stems beyond accommodation and the attention that is given to particular institutions. But there are major policy issues that give other universities an unfair advantage. For instance, if both you and I are studying law and I study at the University of Pretoria and you're studying at the University of Zululand, hypothetically, the APS system, the APS points are much higher at UP as opposed to Zululand. And therefore, when it comes to an issue of employment prospects, I'm more likely to be accepted or to be first preference at a law firm as opposed to you coming from University of Zululand. What I'm trying to say here is that the preferential treatment given to institutions is so embedded in society, is so embedded in the way the system functions that we need to become more deliberate in terms of how do we de-link these particular historical trajectories that give an unfair advantage of some students over the others. And I mean, for instance, even when we look at classical point example would be, I'll make an example, the University of Cape Peninsula University of Technology, which is currently on a protest.
I'm told to wrap.
CPUT, which is currently on a protest over the issue of accommodation, but it will not get this particular media attention. In fact, much of the media is not even aware that CPUT Bellville campus is protesting over the same issues. We need to become more deliberate in terms of addressing issues in historically disadvantaged universities.
Thabo Shingange, as always, great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
That was the South African Union of Students spokesperson, Thabo Shingange, on Nightline.